On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched strikes on Iran. Within days, the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil passes, was effectively closed for shipping. That event happened thousands of kilometers from India, but its aftershock landed squarely on one district in Gujarat, a place most people outside the tile business have never heard of. Morbi. Morbi is India's ceramic capital. About 600 to 650 factories operate there, producing roughly 90% of India's entire ceramic and tile output. That is an industry worth between 60,000 and 75,000 crore rupees every single year. And nearly all of it depends on one thing to keep running: gas. Propane delivered by road tankers from companies like IOCL, BPCL and HPCL, and piped natural gas supplied through Gujarat Gas Limited. When the war in West Asia choked off the supply of imported fuel, Morbi's lifeline was cut. The speed of the collapse was staggering. By March 6, 2026, about 100 ceramic units had shut down in just 2 days. Manojbhai Erwadia, the president of the Morbi Ceramic Manufacturers Association, described it bluntly. He said industrialists are going through a very difficult situation. Around 100 ceramic factories had to shut down in just 2 days due to the sudden stoppage of propane gas supply. By March 10th, the number of closed factories had climbed to 170. Warnings came that up to 450 could follow. And that is exactly what happened. By March 18th, the Morbi Ceramics Manufacturers Association made a collective decision. They agreed to shut down over 400 units for 20 to 25 days, targeting a restart around April 10th to 15th. Propane and natural gas supply had dropped to about 50% of what factories needed. Running at half fuel was burning money, not making tiles, so the industry just stopped. Think about that number for a moment. 450 factories shutting their doors at once. That is roughly 90% of Morbi's entire ceramic capacity gone dark. And this is not just about tiles sitting unproduced in a warehouse somewhere. This sector employs more than 4 lakh people, directly and indirectly. That is 400,000 workers, supervisors, truck drivers, warehouse staff, and their families who suddenly had no paycheck. Migrant laborers, many of whom had traveled from other states to work in these factories, started packing up and heading home. That exodus creates its own problem because when you want to restart, those workers are not waiting by the factory gate. They have moved on, and convincing them to come back takes time and trust. Now here is where the story gets more complicated, because Morbi was just the most visible wound. Gujarat has around 411,733 registered industries across the state. According to Gujarat government data from early April 2026, 1,212 of those industries were fully shut. Another 28,157 were operating at reduced capacity. That is not a localized problem. That is a statewide slowdown. Let's move beyond ceramics for a moment. In Surat, one of India's biggest textile hubs, factories started cutting operational days from 7 to 5 per week. Workers saw their daily hours slashed. Ashok Jirawala, president of the Federation of Gujarat Weavers Welfare Association, raised the alarm about the disruption hitting the textile trade. Losses in Surat's textile sector were estimated at about 90 to 100 crore rupees per day. And then there is a sector you might not expect to be caught in the crossfire of a Middle Eastern war: soap and detergent. Gujarat has a large cluster of small-scale soap and detergent makers, many of them tiny MSME operations. These businesses depend on a chemical called LABSA, which is a key ingredient in liquid and powder detergents. Before the conflict, LABSA cost about 135 rupees per kilogram. By mid-April 2026, that price had surged to roughly 300 rupees per kilogram. That is more than double. Packaging material costs followed the same pattern. Soap packaging that previously cost 36 rupees jumped to 70 rupees. Naresh Jain, chairman of the Soap and Detergent Association Gujarat, watched as about 80 to 90% of small detergent units shut down. Between 15,000 and 20,000 workers in that sector alone lost their jobs. Ramesh Sudesha, a representative of the same association, pointed out that small-scale manufacturers hold more than 70% of the market share in rural areas. If raw materials continue to be sold at inflated rates, he said, then many units would be unable to resume operations. These small companies compete against multinational brands, but lack the long-term procurement contracts that larger corporations use to lock in prices. When costs spike, they absorb the hit directly, and many simply cannot survive it. So here is a question worth asking. Is all of this actually about gas shortages, or is something else going on? Because the Gujarat state government has offered a different explanation. According to official statements, the government says the reason for many of these closures is financial stress, not just gas shortages. Their argument is that rising costs, input inflation, and a slowdown in export demand were already squeezing margins before the war started. The conflict just accelerated a collapse that was already building. Industry associations push back hard on that reading. They argue that fuel and gas shortages are the primary trigger. The supply simply vanished almost overnight, and no amount of financial planning can keep a kiln running without gas. The debate matters because the diagnosis determines the cure. If the government is right that this is a financial viability problem, the solution looks like credit support, tax relief, and export incentives. If industry is right that this is a supply crisis, then the government needs to find alternative fuel sources fast. The central government did take action. On March 15th, 2026, the ministry issued the Natural Gas Supply Regulation Order under the Essential Commodities Act. This order was designed to ration gas supplies, prioritizing domestic household consumption, especially cooking gas over industrial use. That decision made sense from a political standpoint.
In a decisive move to counter the geopolitical disruptions in the West Asia, the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas has issued an emergency directive to the oil refineries. On Monday, the ministry issued a directive via X ordering all the domestic oil refineries to immediately ramp up the liquefied petrol.
You cannot have families unable to cook dinner, but it meant factories were officially told they were second in line. There were also some pricing adjustments. Gas tariffs for certain industrial customers were revised downward from 119 rupees and 90 paisa to 82 rupees and 95 paisa per standard cubic meter by Adani Total Gas Limited. That helped ease the burden for factories that were still running, but it did nothing for the ones that had already gone dark because there was no gas to buy at any price. Some factory owners have tried to make the best of a bad situation. Many units are using the shutdown period for maintenance work, fixing equipment, upgrading kilns, and doing repairs they would normally postpone. It is a silver lining, but a thin one. Maintenance does not generate revenue, and loan payments do not pause just because your factory is idle. The ripple effects stretch far beyond Gujarat's borders. Morbi's tiles and ceramics go to construction sites across India and to export markets around the world. When 90% of India's ceramic capacity goes offline for 3 to 4 weeks, that supply gap hits builders, retailers, and consumers. Surat's textiles feed into fashion supply chains nationally and internationally. The soap and detergent shortages affect rural markets where small brands dominate shelves. What makes this story so striking is how a conflict between nations, thousands of kilometers away, can reach into a small factory town in western India and shut it down within days. India imports vast quantities of LNG and propane through shipping routes that pass near or through conflict zones. The Strait of Hormuz is the bottleneck. When that bottleneck closes, it does not matter how efficient your factory is or how skilled your workers are. Without fuel, the machines stop. As of early April 2026, the planned reopening date for most Morbi ceramic units was around April 14th to 15th. But that timeline came with a big caveat. It depends entirely on whether fuel supply improves. If propane and natural gas deliveries do not recover to adequate levels, the shutdown could extend further. And every additional week of closure makes it harder to bring back workers, fulfill pending orders, and maintain relationships with buyers who are already looking for alternatives. The factories of Gujarat are not shut because of bad management or poor planning. They are shut because the fuel that powers them travels through one of the most contested waterways on Earth, and when that waterway became a war zone, the supply just stopped. The question now is not just when these factories reopen, but what India does to make sure a conflict it has no control over cannot shut down its industrial heartland again.